So that's why I've broken this into two parts. And I believe, I don't know if I had a chance to introduce myself, but let me just say a few words about who I am. I'm a medical doctor. I'm also a PhD in medical geography. My medical specialties are physical medicine and rehabilitation, or PM&R, and hospice and palliative medicine. And I've been in practice really since, for about 6 years, 6 or 7 years since I completed my training. And my practice these days is at a integrative medicine clinic. That's my predominant outpatient practice at a place called the Ames Institute, where we do a lot of work with palliative care, oncology, rehabilitation, neurologic conditions, and psychiatric conditions. And we try to use holistic approaches and also cutting-edge therapies and try to research our outcomes. I also work for the multi-care health system as an on-call doctor for hospice and palliative care. I've served, I have faculty appointments in School of Medicine and University of Washington, Department of Geography at University of Washington, Bastyr University, a few universities around town, and I've been involved in the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, involved in the Integrative Medicine Special Interest Group and the Safe Use of Psychedelic Assisted Therapies Forum. So that's me in a nutshell, and I'll be happy to answer further questions about my background or anything you'd like to know. But what I'm here today to do is to talk to you about, let's see, second slide is about the activities required in order to get the contact hours for this. So check in with the faculty, with Julie about that. The objectives of this talk are going to be eightfold. And again, this is sort of span over two parts. First, existential distress or stress. What does that mean, and how does that relate to illness and to being mortal? Secondly, talking about the integral spiritual dimension of health. Thirdly, the integrative turn, or the fifth wave in public health. What's going on there? Fourth, how to make healthcare practice frameworks, nested healthcare practice frameworks that are spiritually and trauma-informed. Fifth, describe something called polyvagal theory and the role of awe and the meaning-making imperative. 6, entheogens, defining those and what entheogenic integrative care is. 7, going into practice perspectives and higher order clinical evidence on entheogens. And 8, describe and present present and future ways to potentially practice entheogenic integrative care with cannabis, ketamine, psilocybin, ayahuasca, and of course others. So it's a long roadmap, and we'll have plenty of time to dig into all of this. So sit back. The first topic we're going to cover is existential anxiety. So what is that? So this is a form of existential distress or suffering. This is something that in hospice and palliative medicine, medical professionals are trained to diagnose and treat, but the treatments aren't specialized. It's just a matter of recognizing it's there and trying to do holistic care. The specific nature of the common themes that have been described are a lack of meaning and purpose, a loss of connectedness with others, or to others, thoughts about the dying process, struggles around the state of being, difficulty finding a sense of self, loss of hope, loss of autonomy, loss of temporality. This kind of distress can lead to reduced quality of life, understandably, increases anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, desire for haste and death. This is really this is a big challenge. And in the field of hospice and palliative medicine, though we can understand it, it's very, like I said, it's very, very hard to do much about, rather than instead of just sort of like, well, let's send in our chaplains, let's send in our social workers, let's send in our nurses, let's make sure that they talk to their doctors, their families, their whatever resources they have. And so it's something that is vexing, and certainly is associated with life-threatening and life-limiting illness. I should mention that. But on the other hand, it's also seen in this other way that you see in the cancer survivorship literature called the Damocles sword effect. So the Damocles sword effect, you can see in this slide here, it's an artist's depiction of a woman who's a cancer survivor who's living in the constant shadow of a previous cancer diagnosis. So you can see on the left, she's hooked up to chemo and in a wheelchair, and it's a kind of a dark time. And then on the right side, presumably has completed cancer treatment, is sitting, in a chair in a lit room, trying to smell a flower on a column, but there's a sword hanging over her head. The Damocles sword is a trope from ancient Greece, and there was a king Damocles who says, yeah, it's great to be king, but there's always a horsehair, a sword suspended by a horsehair hanging over your head, which could drop at any moment. And so that's sort of an example of like, well, this I'm sitting here smelling this flower, but my life could be completely altered because of a recurrence, fear of recurrence. So this has been described in the survivorship literature. And it's another kind of form of existential distress. So, then stepping back out of these conditions of, life-threatening, life-limiting illness or recurrence, let's talk about existential stress. So existential stress is really just a part of being mortal. And I think this is something that we should talk more about. So let's just recognize that, from the time we become aware of our own mortality, we develop existential concerns, which could be mild or severe, depending on a variety of factors and triggers, such as actual or threatened death, injury, illness, deprivation, or other kinds of trauma. And given how critical socialization is in our development as mammals, in our neuropsychological development, you can also see existential concerns arising when you have crises related to a relationship or disturbances in social acceptance. So this could be like ostracization, betrayal, oppression, or other related pressures or traumas. In this way, you can also see catastrophic illness as a kind of social death threat that threatens your ability to socially function in the way that you, had intended or were doing previously. So you can see existential issues coming up in terms of these social disturbances. And, I think from evolutionary psychology, it's worth noting that we humans, this is likely an evolutionary adaptation because we humans for millennia lived in hunter-gatherer clans, and we're dependent on the group for basic shelter, protection, and survival. And so anytime somebody was outcasted from that group situation, that social protection would likely translate into death. And because it's just so hard to survive. So that's sort of how existential concerns probably have been linked in our evolution with the social distress, social ruptures. So I like this quote from Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing, who famously and fairly observed, "Life, you see, is a sexually transmitted disease, and there is a 100% mortality rate." So that's sort of like jokingly saying, hey, we are all part of like this thing, we're all going to die. And it's, it's sexually transmitted because that's how we procreate, whether it's a disease or not. I mean, that's part of the joke here, but it just really shows you that there is a universality of existential stress. And I think this really helps to beg the question or undergird the importance of what this concept that I'm going to talk more about in the next slides, spiritual health and well-being, and how that's an essential core dimension of health. So we're going to talk now about a definition of spirituality that's been used in healthcare. And there's many such definitions. I chose this one from Puchalski et al., who were kind of working in setting up guidelines in hospice and palliative care. And so they describe spirituality as an aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. So the critical elements in this definition meaning, connectedness, the search for the significant or sacred. Spirituality is an aspect of humanity. So it's broad. So it includes philosophical, religious, existential issues, and you can see that it's not tied to any institutional, religious institutions of any kind or organized religions. Is really something inherent in the human condition, an aspect of humanity. And so, even the American Nurses Association and the American Holistic Nurses Association has even a deeper definition of spirituality that I also shared here for you. They say the feelings, thoughts, experiences, and behaviors that arise from a search for meaning, that which is generally considered sacred or holy, usually, though not universally, considered to involve a sense of connection with an absolute, immanent, or transcendent spiritual force, however named, as well as the conviction that meaning, value, direction, and purpose are valid aspects of the individual and universe. The essence of being and relatedness that permeates all of life and is manifested in one's knowing, doing, and being. The interconnectedness with self, others, nature, God / life force / absolute / transcendent, not necessarily synonymous with religion. So that's kind of just wanted to, there's a lot of different definitions there. You can see that a lot of this is also sort of how people define it for themselves and what aspects are of spirituality do they define or highlight. But I think this is quite a expansive area, and it's quite remarkable to practice healthcare or understand maladies, illness, and healing and well-being without really taking this dimension into account, because it's so vast. And so I think, this is one of the reasons why the World Health Organization definition of health includes actually this spiritual dimension. And this was a process, and so I just thought I'd highlight this for you, that the largest international body that works on health. In May 1983, there were 22 member countries proposed a draft resolution affirming the spiritual dimension in health. And then in January 1998, the executive board of the WHO adopted a resolution recommending the adding of spiritual to the definition of health. And so that definition now reads as follows, that health is a dynamic state of complete physical, mental, spiritual, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And then there's another definition that's been put in the literature about, okay, well, if that's what health is, what is spiritual health? Is there a spiritual health, or just like there's physical health, and there's mental health, and there's social health? What is spiritual health or well-being? And some researchers in India coined it this way: a state of being where an individual is able to deal with day-to-day life in a manner which leads to the realization of one's full potential, meaning and purpose of life, and happiness from within. So that's sort of a practical implication of having spiritual health and well-being, that you can deal with life, day-to-day life, in a manner which furthers you in your realization of what your potential is and what your sense of meaning and purpose is, and of course the pursuit of happiness. And I think that's really interesting to see it that way as well, because at least in the United States that we're here, this pursuit of happiness idea is something that's been very deeply enshrined in the natural formations of what it means to be, under a form of government, and what should be protected. So, addressing the scientific link. This is Astrid Stuckelberger, who's a professor at the University of Geneva Public Health Medical School. She says, addressing the scientific link between religion, spirituality, and health has too often been a forgotten subject, avoided for irrational, emotional, or political reasons. She says it's time for the scientific community to integrate religious and spiritual factors which have guided human behavior over centuries into health and human sciences. So, I think this is now a little shift gears to talking about, well, what is a new public health paradigm and a healthcare paradigm that really integrates this dimension? What would that really look like, if we were to take that seriously? And so I've really been inspired by the work of Phil Hanlon and colleagues who are in Glasgow in Scotland, and they've written this book called The Future Public Health, and they've written also several other articles in the public health literature describing the fact that we need a new paradigm in public health. And of course, let me cover that with you here. I think it's really something that will help us move towards a more integrative framework all around. So. They say that one of the functions of public health is to envision a different future, one in which current health problems can be avoided and health can improve. But we frequently limited in public health by something called short-termism, which is really encouraged by the political powers, which means, you just sort of think about short-term goals, let's just get out of this particular situation. And then we're also limited by reductionism, which is, which is in the current scientific paradigm, really is encouraged by the current way we think about things. But these two forces, short-termism and reductionism, are really enemies of creativity and insight. Sarah Stewart Brown, a professor of public health at Warwick Medical School in England, said that this book, Future Public Health, investigates well-being and shows how our current way of life in the Western world, based on consumerism, individualism, competitiveness, and the workplace treadmill, does not lend itself to well-being. The things that make for well-being, uncommitted time, pleasure in others' company, creative endeavor, and giving to others, all these things we tend to squeeze out. And so the authors in the Future Public Health are proposing a new way of thinking about public health based on a systems approach, which are at the heart holistic and integrative. And so they recognize that Cartesian thinking, the mind-body split, a certain form of reductionism, is well past its sell-by date. She goes on to say, we cannot go on pretending that the mind and body operate independently, or that neither is affected by the state of our spirits. We must find a way of thinking and planning that takes into account their fundamental interrelatedness. So to do so, we need to embrace complexity theory and other now well-established scientific paradigms that are not taught as part of the public health curriculum, or really any kind of healthcare curriculums. So that sort of sets up the stage for what exactly, what this paradigm looks like. So it's really worthwhile digging into what has public health been for us over the decades, over the centuries, really. And so this slide shows you kind of a graphic showing what are the four waves of public health, going back to literally the 19th century and earlier. And there's other things on this graph that's before even that, like the Enlightenment and development of medicine as a science in the 18th century and that kind of thing. But so in the first wave is we talk about the great public works period, municipalism, and the second wave, refining the scientific approach, the germ theory of diseases, hospitals. The third wave was restructuring of institutions, welfare reforms, new housing, social security. The fourth wave, this risk theory of disease, lifestyle issues, smoking, diet, physical activity. Here's another way to look at that. So in that first wave, water and sanitation, and the second wave, there's, manufacturing, medicine, engineering, transport, communications. There's lots of breakthroughs in these fields, and with the help of scientific rationalism. The third wave, you see more of this welfare consensus developing, social housing, universal education. And the fourth wave is really the wave that was going on from 1960 to 2000, around the time when I started my medical school, was about risk factors and how to modify risk factors in lifestyle. And there was an emergence then at that time of a nascent concern with social inequalities in health. The graph on the bottom shows you that each wave builds on the previous wave. And so there's wave one, and then wave two kind of comes onto the top of that wave, and wave three, wave four. And so this is how public health has operated over the centuries, and there's been some significant successes. But despite these four waves of advancement, we have great crises in this period that we can call late modernity. And these crises are existential, and they're intersecting, they're complex, and they're multifactorial. Some of these crises include things like worsening obesity, rising loss of well-being, worsening inequality, rising sustainability and environmental crises. Think about anthropogenic, global climate change, environmental degradation, the fact that oil is more scarce, and what the impacts of peak oil and oil extraction, fossil fuels, have on so many factors. Viral pandemics, rising rates of depression, suicide, anxiety, addictions. These are called diseases of despair. And there's, of course, ongoing threats of, omnicidal, meaning like can kill everybody, nuclear war or mass casualty violence. There's exponential population growth. There's ongoing global economic crises. So it's quite the situation these are complex problems. And the authors are saying that really we need to kind of, public health needs to help us with this layer, these complex processes, and where we are right now, that a lot of these issues are driven by, they call the isms, the crises of late modernity. So what are the aspects? Let's go into that. So they say that the mental health and well-being across all modern Western societies are being damaged by particular aspects of contemporary culture. Number one, economism. This is the tendency to view the world through the lens of economics, to regard a country as an economy rather than a society, and to believe that economic considerations and values are the most important ones. Secondly, materialism, and of course it's handmade consumerism, it's a corollary. And this is the attempt to acquire meaning, happiness, and fulfillment through the acquisition and possession of material things. Material values rank higher than spiritual values, and non-material aspects of life may be squeezed out. And then finally, individualism. Now, individualism is something that is quite a bit in the discourse in the American society. But let's think about what it, in the extreme, the ism aspect looks like. It's a social environment. Individualism is a social environment where the onus of success and responsibility of failure rests with individuals and individuals alone. So we can be subject to what they call the tyranny of excessive choice and higher expectations of life, together with reduced social support and social controls. And all of this can lead to a sense of increased risk, uncertainty, and insecurity. So that's sort of the crises, economism, materialism, consumerism, individualism that they describe, that of late modernity that's impacting and contributing to these various existential crises. So let's talk about what this fifth wave, this new wave of public health would look like. And they describe this emerging fifth wave is based on an emphatic focus on well-being, centering on a new image of what it means to be human. So the features of this kind of wave would be integrative, ecological, ethical, and really requiring and fostering creativity and taking into account the beautiful, aesthetics, and how beauty is so critical part of of what drives us, actually. So this is really fascinating, and I think I want to talk a little bit more about these qualities of this wave. So they say that let's get out of this idea, getting out of that we have simple, predictable, controllable systems, but actually, and get us into recognizing that we are part of complex adaptive systems with multiple equilibrium points and unpredictably sensitive to small changes. Let's get out of this mindset of like antibiotics, war on drugs, combating inequalities, to pro. What is pro-well-being, pro-balance, pro-integration? Let's get out of the frame of dominion and independence, dominion in terms of specialist knowledge and expertise, to greater independence and cooperation where we can learn from and with others. Let's rebalance our orientation. So we should integrate the objective with the subjective. So objective means measurement of biological and social processes, and subjective, what is lived experience? What about inner transformation? And then let's talk about something called the intersubjective. What are the shared symbols, meanings, values, beliefs, and aspirations that we have intersubjectively? So thinking in terms of public health beyond just the objective, but to include these other dimensions. Thinking about the future, what does a future consciousness look like, and how can that inform the present? Can we have an innovation that feeds the future rather than propping up the current unsustainable situation? Can we think about different forms of growth beyond the economic to promote high values of human welfare? Can we iterate and scale up? Let's try, learning a design process where we try things out, learn from that, and then share that learning. And that's called scaling up as a natural process of growth. And this is rather than the mechanistic process of managers and large bureaucracies having responsibility for rolling things out, so a top-down approach. So these are some of the features that they describe. And there's, this talk is not all, there's so much more to say about this, but I wanted to sort of just lay this deck out because I think this really shows you a system in which you can really integrate a lot of these ineffable, these spiritual inner dimensions into a larger framework of public health, which then will trickle down into healthcare provision of all kinds. So finally, final slide on this is a wonderful image that the authors put together showing the similarity of their model, their integral model, which is basically of the four-box method model of reality that Ken Wilber has put together, the integral model, where he imagines that, okay, we have the individual level and we have the collective level. And at the individual level, you have the subjective interior, and at the collective level, you have the subjective interior. And then at the objective exterior, we have the individual level and we have the collective level. And so that means, so the different pronouns that you can think of is we have I, you think of I at the individual subjective level, and then you think of we is the subjective interior collective level. And then the objective level is it for individual and it's for collective. So the inner world, culture, the body as the physical world, and society all fit into each of these boxes. But what's happened is we pretty much, in most of our field of medicine and public health, have only looked at the objective exterior dimensions, the individual and collective level, the it and the its. And we ignored or did not integrate the inner worlds, the I and the we. And so to put those into one model where we can see all of those together is what they're talking about. And it turns out that Plato had this idea as well, that really to make a decision, to understand what direction you want to go in, you want to combine what he says is the beautiful, the good, and the true. And so that's another way of thinking about the beautiful, which is art, the good, which is like morals and ethics, and the true, which is science. And so, this is a way of thinking about combining also these different dimensions of the individual and collective level. So that's sort of I just want to like propose this as, when we think about interventions, both at the individual level or the societal level, how can we inform ourselves with what's right, what's true, and what's beautiful? And maybe those three things together will help us figure out what the right direction is. So now we're going to step out of public health and talk about now, well, what kind of healthcare framework fits into a framework of integrative fifth wave public health? Well, that would be a type of healthcare that is spiritually aware, as we've discussed, but also, and this is really important, that's trauma informed. I think trauma is a huge missing component of understanding in many dimensions of health, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So this is a quote here from Peter Levine, a second author of Frederick in '97. He's done a lot of work in understanding the somatic impacts of trauma. So he says that trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. Although it is a source of tremendous distress and dysfunction, it is not an ailment or a disease. And this is really something. It's a byproduct of an instinctively instigated altered state of consciousness. When we enter this altered state, let us call it survival mode, when we perceive that our lives are being threatened, if we are overwhelmed by the threat and are unable to successfully defend ourselves, we can become stuck in survival mode. This highly aroused state is designed solely to enable short-term defensive actions, but if left untreated over time, it begins to form the symptoms of trauma. So you can see we're really diving into that deep inner dimension of the four boxes, that individual inner dimension. Also, it goes into the collective. But you really want to understand things like trauma, because this plays such a huge role in people's inner experiences. So the symptoms of trauma can invade every aspect of our lives, because trauma represents a basic rupture. It's a loss of connection to ourselves, our family, and the world. The loss, although enormous, is sometimes difficult to appreciate because it happens gradually. We adjust to these slight changes, sometimes without taking notice of them at all. The standard view in psychiatric medicine has always been that trauma is basically untreatable or only marginally controllable by drugs. However, and now these concepts are much more well understood. In the mid-90s, this wasn't really, the idea that treating trauma thoroughly through healing can lead not only to symptom reduction but long-term transformation is really the goal of what we should be working towards. So here's an image I got from Twitter that shows how many things that can the symptom clusters that can come out of trauma. Everything from depression, irritability, loss of interest, numbing, decreased concentration, hopelessness, shame, self-hatred, panic attacks, emotional overwhelm, chronic pain, headaches, eating disorders, substance abuse, self-destructive behaviors, hypervigilance, et cetera, et cetera. So and you can see there are shades here of what we were talking about earlier with existential anxiety, because this helps you understand that these especially the existential anxiety that's triggered by illness or major incidents, that this is a form of trauma response. So that's something worth noting. And so let's talk about the causes of trauma. We often think about, on the left-hand side, we look at these obvious causes of trauma: war, severe childhood emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, neglect, betrayal, abandonment during childhood, experiencing or witnessing violence, rape, catastrophic illnesses and injuries, as we talked about. But there's all these other less obvious potential causes of trauma, which include minor automobile accidents, especially with whiplash, invasive medical and dental procedures, particularly performed on children restrained or anesthetized. Use of ether actually increases the chance of trauma in pelvic exams. These are all examples of medicalized procedural trauma. Falls or other even so-called minor injuries, especially when children or elderly folks are involved. Natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, and floods. Illnesses, not even just like when you have a high fever or accidental poisoning. Being left alone, like especially in young children and babies. Again, prolonged immobilization, especially in children, like if you're wearing a cast, or splinting for long periods of time, used in scoliosis or in-towing. Exposure to extreme cold and heat, especially in, again, young children and babies. Birth stress. So I just think, there's a lot more places to look at what could be driving trauma, and that's what they're highlighting here. So next we're going to move into a broader understanding of really how, again, getting into that inner dimension, what are the circuits, what are the neural circuits that we as humans have evolved in terms of regulating our behavior and physiological adaptations to safe, dangerous, and life-threatening environments. And I think the work of this anatomist, Stephen Porges, is really remarkable and, I think foundational to understand trauma, its response, and its healing, and a lot of aspects of distress in society. So what Porges discovered, we've traditionally thought about, the fight or flight and rest and digest. That's sort of what you get taught in high school and beyond, really, of these branches of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. But actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. And there's, you want to think about it actually at 3 levels of the nervous system. that you have this, you have something called the most advanced form of our nervous system is called the social nervous system, and that's the most evolved one. And then there's a sympathetic adrenal system, which is really active avoidance, mobilization. And then there's this part of our nervous system that comes from the vagus nerve, but it's not the myelinated vagus nerve, it's the unmyelinated vagus nerve, also called the dorsal vagal complex. And this is a circuit that really leads to immobilization. So like how to play dead, how to passively avoid. And so, there's actually, all of these circuits are, I have in the slide here, you can see the different places on the brain stem where the different nuclei for these different components, these nerves arise from. And so, it's worth looking at that in a little further detail. I think the ventral vagus is sort of the big one that I think not many folks talk about or know about, also called the ventral vagus complex. And it's based on the nucleus ambiguous, in the brainstem, and I think this area is really remarkable because it sends fibers from the brainstem to the face, the muscles of facial expression, the neck, the throat, and the heart. So there's a connection between the face and the heart. And this really jives so well with understanding like how human beings regulate each other through facial expression and the impact that can have on slowing down the heart or the heart connection. Okay, so next slide really again shows the fact that social engagement is the most modern aspect of our nervous system. It's a sophisticated set of responses supporting massive cortical development, enabling maternal bonding, extended protection of vulnerable immature cortex processors. Extended protection of vulnerable immature cortex processors. So, meaning you have to have social engagement like maternal bonding to help protect your vulnerable developing body and brain. And then developing language and social structures via facial functions. So, the most ancient is the primitive passive feeding and reproduction system that creates a metabolic baseline of operation to manage oxygen and nourishment via the blood. The next level is a sympathetic, more sophisticated set of responses enabling mobility. So, what you want, this is called a triune, an autonomic nervous system, 3 different layers. Already these has huge implications and helps us understand things like, that really the goal of a lot of therapy is supporting the social nervous system, the protection and support of the newest and most powerful ANS division. And, I think this is a top priority in health treatments and childcare, and many other areas. And then, really thinking about how in healthcare and educational settings we can foster feelings of social warmth to optimize inner autonomic processes for maximum immune system performance, self-healing efficiency, and learning capacity. And then finally, like the way that certain types of trauma that actually are betrayals, trauma of betrayal, is one of the most damaging types of trauma, because it has a particularly deep effect, because it, the most modern and like betrayal PTSD, the highest and most modern autonomic nervous system function, which is the social, is damaged at a subconscious implicit memory level with long-lasting but reversible effects on wellness and resilience. So these are some of the implications of this. This slide shows you how you can see the different aspects of this autonomic nervous system in eye and voice contact in the social side of things, capacity for empathy and social interaction, spontaneous feelings in social contexts, involuntary motor actions of the face, mouth, and throat, facial warmth and tingling. And that's interpersonal responses and awareness. So how you feel when you're having social connections and engagement and feeling connected. And then the sympathetic nervous system, faster respiration, quicker heart rate, pupil dilation, pale skin color, increased sweating, cold skin, decreased digestion and peristalsis, mobilization behaviors. including anxiety, anger, and fear. And then the parasympathetic, slow, deeper respiration, slower heart rate, decreased blood pressure, pupil constriction, and immobilization behaviors, and increased digestion. So these are just sort of another way to think about it. And what are the functions of the autonomic nervous system? In the social side, it's about love, it's social organization, breath, prosody, vocalization, interaction, play. Sympathetic is mobilization for daily challenges, and parasympathetic, resting and rebuilding. So normally we flow rhythmically and interchangeably through these different areas of our autonomic nervous system. But if you fixate on a particular branch of the autonomic nervous system or you have a loss of flow, this is a sign of some kind of trauma or PTSD potentially. So I think that's sort of the way to think about these things. So here's another graphic actually that shows the floor. I can orient myself. I can be attuned. I can socially engage. I have curiosity, connection. This is again the place you want to be. But then you can have some arousal, some activation, and then you can get a neuroception of danger, sympathetic state. You're defensively oriented. You might be fighting or flighting or fawning. Frustration, irritability, anger, rage, wariness, nervousness, anxiety, panic, attachment, cry, cling, tend. So these are some of the our attachments can get tied up in this area, and we're really in this state of danger. And then really, if the most severe is you're neurocepting and you're like, okay, my life is in danger, life threat. So in that state, it's a sort of disorientation, and you're just freezing, you're folding, you're fainting, and so you might have collapsed immobility, energy conservation, helplessness, defeat, dissociation, even shame, shutdown, disconnection, numbing, depressed life energy, submission, derealization, depersonalization. So these are the different ways in which you can think about like how we go through these different stages with certain types of severe triggers or recognizing safety or danger. And here's another slide that really sees it as a stoplight. So the goal is to move to the green light, ventral vagal. The yellow is sympathetic, and the dorsal vagus is red. So moving into that safe zone, and how to do that. So this is now. So now that we have this sort of comprehensive framework to understand. The ways in which our nervous systems are hooked up and what states that we need to be in for the maximal growth, and how danger and life threat change us internally. What are the ways already? Like, for example, first of all, is there any validation to this theory? Like, is this just some anatomy, or how can we actually prove this in some way? And this research from Jennifer Steller here, who's did her PhD in psychology at UC Berkeley. This is a really interesting study, and I think it shows you the link between social behavior and our vagus nerve. So that's one of the takeaways of polyvagal theory. So what Jennifer Steller and her team predicted is that given that we think that the vagus nerve supports social behavior, promoting communication, social engagement, coping or self-soothing in social situations, and basically pro-social behavior, she predicted that the experience of compassion in response to the suffering of others is associated with greater vagus nerve activation. So can you show that? Can you prove that? So what she tested this hypothesis across 4 studies in which participants witnessed others suffer, while she recorded physiological measures, including a non-invasive index of vagal activity called the respiratory sinus arrhythmia, heart rate, respiration, and skin conductance. So you're hooked up you're seeing images that invoke compassion, and then you're getting your heart rate and your respirations and skin conductance measured. There's something called the respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is, you can see on an EKG, it's a splitting of some of the early beats. And when you see more of that, that means there's more vagal tone in the heart. And so what she showed in her study participants exhibited greater respiratory sinus arrhythmia, RSA, activity during the compassion induction compared to a neutral control. And they also showed greater RSA activity when you had another positive emotion that was conveyed, not just compassion, but other positive emotions. And then also with this positive emotion was, invoked more vagal tone. And then there was a pro-social emotion that lacked the presence of suffering. So all of these emotions and states could impact showed increased RSA activity. And these were accompanied by decreases in heart rate and occasionally by increases in respiration, but not changes in skin conductance. So she says that this work suggests that compassion engages the vagus nerve, facilitating this pro-social response to others' suffering. So really that's kind of one of the takeaway points that I want to bring up here, is how critically important social engagement could be and compassion to relieving distress. So the next, the implications of this is also really useful for how to help people give first aid to their sympathetic nervous system. If people are in trauma loops, let's say there's a symptom in the body that, how to kind of, get out of a loop. So, for example, directing attention into the body to notice a sensation. So if you're in front of somebody and they're like, okay, I'm having a panic response or a trauma response, you say, all right, well, let's attend to that portion of the body where you're noticing that sensation. And this is a way to bring a present tense orientation. And so, because in trauma, you frequently have there's a tendency to like jump to the future or jump to the past. So let's stay in the present. And then you orient people to the lower portion of the sensation. Let's go to the lower portion, closer to the ground, downward. And this effectively counters the upward effect of trauma, alarming and orienting responses. Next is the slowing everything down. Instead of trauma's tendency to speed things up, let's slow down the person that's experiencing this. So attend to the lower portion of the sensation, and let's get into the details of the sensation. And then finally, let's get the attention away from this. Let's go to something else, like in the environment maybe, and then come back for a minute, and then come back to the first site. And this effectively reestablishes movement, polarity coming in and out, and counters trauma's tendency to get fixated on something. So these are some of the ways in which the implications of how the nervous system works can help people through difficult symptoms that might be related to trauma. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which, how this concept of trauma has been studied in palliative care. And what are the implications of doctors and researchers who've been looking and working in palliative care for a long time. So Dr. Ann Berger, one of my mentors at NIH, she says that palliative care providers have for a long time recognized that there are seriously ill or terminal patients who progress beyond the experiences of psychological trauma, coping, and acceptance. And these are patients that feel changed for the better or stronger mentally compared to the way they were before their disease was diagnosed. This phenomenon of ending up stronger mentally than they were before the onset of their illness has been called healing in palliative care and as well as in integrative medicine. So, it's a remarkable thing to see some patients that, really feel changed for the better, even though they've experienced a catastrophic or life-threatening illness. And so Balfour Mount in Canada really did a phenomenological study of patients in a palliative care unit and talked about what are the factors that tend towards people having more experiences of wholeness and integrity rather than, on the other side, experiences of suffering and anguish. And moving from suffering and anguish to wholeness and integrity is healing, and going from wholeness and integrity to suffering and anguish is wounding. And quality of life is really somewhere in between those two, hopefully, and more on the improved quality of life is closer to wholeness and integrity. And so this kind of the theme, this basically recognizes that healing is a kind of personal change process. The features that patients who were more on the wholeness and integrity side in the palliative care unit were those who felt a sense of connection to self, others, the phenomenal world, and ultimate meaning. They had a sense of meaning in the context of suffering, so suffering had some meaning to it. They were able to find peace in the present moment. They had an experience of a sympathetic, non-adversarial connection to the disease process. They had an ability to choose how they wished, what attitude they wanted to face adversity with, and they were open to the potential in the moment greater than the need for control, so surrender. So these are some of the features that characterize healing in that direction. So our work would be to find ways to help facilitate that move in that direction. And so I think, and all of this will come tying together nicely to the topic of entheogens. In this portion of the talk, I'm really trying to lay the groundwork to help you understand, how our nervous systems operate and what's been seen in healthcare. So just as an aside, the NIH has developed a tool called the NIH Healing Experience of All Life Stressors, or NIH Heals. And it's a really amazing 35-item validated questionnaire that looks at psychosocial, spiritual measures of healing. Connection, reflection, and introspection, trust and acceptance are three of the exploratory areas. So I wanted you to be aware of that, and I think more and more we'll be able to understand where people are at in that process. So another writer, Eric Castle, who's a professor of medical ethics, well known, he wrote in 1982 in the New England Journal of Medicine about the nature of suffering and the goals of medicine. And he said that transcendence is probably the most powerful way in which one is restored to wholeness after an injury to personhood. So what is the way that you get into a wholeness state after again, an injury to personhood is another way to think about trauma, but also life-threatening illness, serious illness. So when experienced, transcendence locates the person in a far larger landscape. The suffering is not isolated by pain, but is brought closer to a transpersonal source of meaning and to the human community that shares those meanings. So this is what's happening when you have a transpersonal, beyond yourself source of meaning, and your suffering is connected to a larger community of humans, and I would say even more than humans. Such an experience need not involve religion in any formal sense. However, in its transpersonal dimension, it is deeply spiritual. So he is highlighting really the key role of transcendent experiences in helping to catalyze this healing response that we're looking for. So this leads me to discussion of the concept of awe. And so awe is really, and again, that's the beginning, first word in the title of my talk, Awesome Medicine. So awe is really a remarkable area of psychology, and so much research has been done now in the field of positive psychology. Here in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, they had a special issue on the power of wonder, modern marvels in the age of science. It just came out this year in 2021. So I'll share some highlights from researchers in the field of awe. And so again, one of them is Jennifer Steller, whose research, PhD work I showed you earlier, on compassion and the heartbeat. So she says that awe is a self-transcendent emotion that exerts a powerful impact on the self. Through diminishing the ego, awe may help cultivate interconnection, wisdom, meaning, and purpose. Michelle Chiot at Arizona State University, she says that awe is experienced as deeply pleasant and centering. It is great for alleviating stress. In well-designed experiments, awe has been found to promote a heightened concern for others. Feelings of connectedness, humility, helping of strangers, pro-environmental attitudes, and behavioral intentions. So what's going on? Why is awe, how can awe have this powerful experience? Well, the researchers have found that we can, and you know, they're doing awe experiments in the lab, so this is really like a unique area, a time in science. So they say that what they're seeing is that when you have an awe experience, you kind of lower the filters of your mental models. You see the world a bit more as it is, less influenced by the cognitive shortcuts and dominant assumptions that we're always, you know, holding on to. So awe kind of opens you up there. Now, they also make this really important point that awe can be used by cult leaders and dictators and conspiracy theory pushers and religious extremists to secure devoted believers to go on to commit atrocities against themselves and others. So because this awe produces a little earthquake in the mind, a moment of malleability, cognitive malleability that offers a chance to expand and reconstruct one's mental model of the world. The model that emerges depends on what happens in the moments during and after encountering the awe stimulus. So that's sort of like, speaks to the importance of setting the table for awe, the preparation, the guidance, you know, to maximize, to make sure that it's, you know, really being molded by those conditions that need to be set up well. So they go on to say that most people will benefit from more awe in their lives. You know, not just people that are, you know, chronically or seriously ill or you know, victims of serious trauma. I mean, there's so much going on in our lives, this sort of late modernity phase. They say that awe provides a moment's respite from the strain and frenetic pace of modern life to encourage some perspective. The researchers say, hey, I need more awe myself. And I think, you know, so how do we experience more awe? As we grow older, we accumulate more and more knowledge and spend the bulk of our time in routine activities and tasks, and we do tend to sort of have less and less awe. Yet awe is readily accessible. Academic researchers and laypersons alike often assume that awe is only evoked by extremely rare experiences, like seeing the Grand Canyon or the view from the Eiffel Tower for the first time. But that's not true. You don't need to have these grand experiences to experience awe. And they make this comment, it's like, that's just like saying that we only feel fear when being violently attacked by a tiger. But just as we experience a bit of fear upon seeing a spider in the bathroom, maybe some of you, we can experience a bit of awe in the course of our normal lives. So, you know, this leads me to talking about the fact that we have in our lives an imperative to make some kind of meaning, and this is sort of what I was telling you earlier. Again, going back to existential concerns, is that we are able to by being in social connection, we mollify our existential concerns, and this is something that Ernest Becker, the social psychologist, wrote a lot about. And given that we have all these individual, global, social, existential conditions, it is necessary for optimal spiritual health and well-being, which again is a core dimension of health, that we be able to search for meaning and purpose. And so it's an imperative in order for us to function and to heal, to adapt. And so what this means is that individuals must have ongoing opportunities for mental and spiritual consolation, and to create again and renew their spirit as they face ongoing and increasing existential concerns. And would you believe it, that these terms, mental and spiritual consolation and creating again and renewing their spirit, these are the words that the definition in late Middle English and Latin from which we have the contemporary word recreation. So recreation is really a vital aspect of helping us to develop meaning and purpose and consolation to create and renew again. And so what we'll turn to in the next part is a discussion of the class of entheogens and what role they play in this meaning-making imperative and healing. Thank you.
2, 3. Testing, testing, we're on. Excellent. We're just going to film a little bit of intros from the last one and the other one, a little off-center, but here we go. Sunil? Everyone's tummy's now full? Got our nutrition? Excellent. Hello, and now we welcome Dr. Sunil Agarwal, MD, PhD, FAA, PMR. Dr. Sunil Agarwal is a physician, innovating scientist, integrative medicine, medical geographer, and an expert in global health. His lecture today will be on part 1 of 2, this conference series. Part 1 being Awesome Medicine, Entheogenic Integrative Care for Relief of Spiritual and Existential Suffering in Serious and Chronic Health Conditions, Trauma, and Beyond. And let's welcome Dr. Sunil Agarwal. Okay. And now we welcome Mary Lynn Mathry with a Master's of Science in Nursing as a registered nurse and a CIRN certified nurse. She today is coming with a Master's of Science in Nursing, and she has also a specialty in addiction specialties. She comes to us from wonderful organizations such as American Cannabis Nurses Association and Patients Out of Time, in which she was part of founding those organizations, and we're so proud. Today, her lecture is on cannabis and substance use disorders, from a gateway drug to an exit modality. Please welcome me, Mary Lynn Mathry.
Hello, everyone. As she said, I'll be talking about cannabis and substance use disorders. We'll talk about what that is all about, the substance use disorders, the newer terms we're using. Disclosure-wise, I have nothing to disclose. Unfortunately, as I tell a lot of my nursing colleagues, this has not been good for the career growth dealing with cannabis in modern medicine today. I've got the Patients Out of Time logo up there. I just want to leave it so people can see. We started in 1995, so just last year we celebrated our 25th anniversary of educating folks about medical cannabis. And as you can see, it's just depicting the cannabis leaf and that 11th hour. Patients don't need more research. This medicine is old as the hills. I bring this one up about the nurses because that's the perspective you're going to get from me as a nurse. We have 4.2 million nurses in the United States, and we're the profession that spends most of the time with patients. So we're seeing them. Are they eating? Are they sleeping? Are they able to move well with some stability? We administer the medications and other treatments, and then we're responsible for monitoring those effects, and we're clearly responsible for educating patients. So That's where it really hits for me. Another main thing for nurses is we're patient advocates. That's vital to our role. And we've been voted the most trusted professionals by the Gallup poll for the last 20 years. Literally, the only time we've been bumped out of first place, so to speak, was in 2001 when the firefighters got that. But up top it says WHO. The World Health Organization declared 2020 Year of the Nurse and the Nurse Midwife. And then when COVID came and the role that nurses have had to play in this, they added that. So nursing, just to give you a little bit of background, I'm an oldie. Started out in the Navy Nurse Corps. And after getting out of that and practicing for so many years, I went back to grad school to get my master's degree, and my thesis was on marijuana disclosure to healthcare professionals. At the time, I knew it was the most used illicit drug. I called it marijuana. I knew it might have been used for nausea and vomiting, from chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. That's about it. And I did this survey. It was on marijuana disclosure to healthcare professionals. Again, that's kind of what got me interested in addictions treatment. We'd see patients, I'm a med-surg nurse by background, and we'd see patients coming in with a problem, tobacco, alcohol, opiates, whatever, and 9 times out of 10, nobody addressed it. Just kind of patched them up and let them go. And that didn't seem right. But anyway, I did my thesis, and so it was marijuana disclosure. Are we asking them about their marijuana use, and would they admit to use? This was 1984, lovely year back then. People didn't talk about marijuana openly at all. So I went to the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws and asked if I could get the survey in their leaflet, if they would send it out. So I did get a lot of responses, and I'm not going to go into the full survey. I can tell you that most were not asked. But the last question was about their health concerns, and they could pick as many little items that I had there as they wanted to. Worried about being addicted, I'm worried about its effect on my brain, my heart, my lungs, if I'm pregnant, the fetus, and I had other. And people started writing in. I use it for glaucoma, helps with my glaucoma. I'm a spinal cord injured patient, helps me. Multiple sclerosis. I used it during pregnancy for morning sickness. And this was new to me. Everything was new and got me to go back and look in the literature, and that's when I discovered cannabis, the old medicine. So fast forward after that, my husband and I co-founded Patients Out of Time because it came clear that healthcare professionals most of them could not make that leap to normal, to fight for the reform of marijuana laws. They still saw it as the devil's weed, whatever, terrible reputation the poor plant got. And we needed healthcare professionals to understand the medical benefits. So we started Patients Out of Time. And then 10 years, that was 1995. It took us 5 years to get our first accredited conference because back then no one would accredit anything on cannabis. And then 10 years into it, our conference series, by 2010, there were enough nurses coming to the conference that a group of us formed the American Cannabis Nurses Association. Anyway, so today what we're going to do is we want the learner to consider cannabis to help mitigate withdrawal symptoms from opiates and other drugs of abuse, including nicotine and alcohol. Consider cannabis as a substitute treatment for substance use disorders, even though there is cannabis use disorder, which we'll discuss. And the learner will recognize the harm reduction value in considering cannabis as a first-line treatment option for numerous conditions such as pain, anxiety, depression, PTSD symptoms, and more, to hopefully never get people to a bad place with drugs. And I like to start this with Todd McArea, the late Todd McArea, California, who's treated so many patients with cannabis and has been a leader in this field. We said we should be thinking about cannabis as a medicine first that happens to have some psychoactive properties, as many medicines do, rather than as an intoxicant that happens to have few therapeutic properties on the side. We've switched. We had that way early on, and then we got into reefer madness, and hopefully we can find our way back again. Historical background, you've already heard from Dr. Bierman and Dr. Dezou, I'm saying it right, Dr. Dezou, the pharmacologist, some of the history, and this is just a little repetition. But just to show you, there was a corn plaster, and the thing about that picture there is if you can see that company, Seabury and Johnson, had branches in London, Hamburg, Sydney, Australia, and Montreal, Canada. So this wasn't just in the United States. This was a popular medicine back in the day. Dysmanine, women used it for menstrual cramps. I have an old Eli Lilly bottle, tincture of cannabis. And one of the things that it was used for was those temporary periods of insanity peculiar to women. So they were medicating PMS back there with cannabis, as well as substance use. And then Canadana, asthma, this was belladonna and cannabis. Asthma cigarettes. So we really used it because it did open up the airways. 1915, Eli Lilly. This is a label from Eli Lilly. If you can read it on the side, it says Cannabis Americana, which is cannabis sativa, American grown back then. And at the bottom, hard to read, but it says, guaranteed by Eli Lilly under the Pure Food and Drug Act, June 30, 1906. So again, folks, this was more or less approved as a medicine back in the day. The other thing it says, it's the best hypnotic in delirium tremens, used with excellent results in habits of opium, chloral, or cocaine. So they knew about it back then. Unfortunately, we've not been taught that. We've gotten into the reefer madness. And again, if people haven't seen that movie, Reefer Madness, from the 70s, when I was in college, that was the big thing. It was entertainment. It's almost so ridiculous, it's hard to think that they meant it to be, depict the true story. But that was the scare. Marijuana was getting into white kids, college kids, high school kids. And then books were all over the place. The Marijuana Girl or Marijuana. People would do anything for marijuana. This was, there's more than one person, et cetera, that got into this. But back when they were trying to pass the Marijuana Tax Act, a lot of crazy stuff about cannabis was going on. I'm going to read this quote from William Randolph Hearst, 1923. By the tons it's coming into this country, the deadly, dreadful poison that racks and tears not only the body, but the very heart and soul of every human being who once becomes a slave to it in any of its cruel and devastating forms. Marijuana is a shortcut to the insane asylum. Smoke marijuana cigarettes for a month, and what was once your brain will be nothing but a storehouse of horrid specters. Hashish makes a murderer who kills for the love of killing out of the mildest mannered man who ever laughed at the idea of any habit could ever get him. So that's welcome to reefer madness. That ended with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act. And again, Dr. Bierman talked about the AMA being against it. They did, and Dr. Woodward, as legislative counsel for the American Medical Association, opposed. And in his remarks, he said the prevention, I think this is so, being able to see into the future or something, the prevention of the use of the drug for medicinal purposes can accomplish no good end whatsoever. How far it may serve to deprive the public of the benefits of a drug that on further research may prove to be of substantial value, it is impossible to foresee. Clueless about the endocannabinoid system, and all of a sudden that explained, because when I would talk to somebody and say, well, it's good for anxiety and it's really good for chronic pain and use it for seizures, the eyes roll back and they go, yeah, right, dream on, girl. But, the endocannabinoid system helps give us that explanation of how it can help everything. So we went a paradigm shift back then from this wonderful, safe medicine, cannabis, to this terrible drug of marijuana. By 1970, with the Nixon administration, we had the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was passed. 3 criteria to be in Schedule I: not safe for medical use, no accepted medical value in the United States, and highly addictive. We all know that doesn't fit, not on any of the counts. Cannabis is a gateway drug to harder drugs. That's pretty much the paradigm I really want to switch. We're going to look at it more as an exit drug from addiction. If we look at other drugs of addiction, it's old, but the properties of drugs don't change. And my goodness, my numbers are gone. I apologize, folks. I can't even remember them offhand. Let's just say tobacco being highly addictive as we go down. Cannabis, they say it's 9% addiction rate for people who use it. And frankly, I think that's high. I have taken care of people in the past with addiction problem. As mentioned in my introduction by Julie, I've been an addictions nurse working at the University of Virginia. Started out teaching and picked up the course on substance abuse so I could learn more about it for my own. And then I kind of went across the aisle and worked at the health system at the University of Virginia and was there, first worked in their addiction treatment program and then worked at the whole hospital system as the addictions consult nurse. And frankly, we did have a patient that I really do believe had a big problem with cannabis. But the 9% don't think that's right. So we want to look at this plant as a botanical medicine. Every time they say the drug, I keep going, it's not a drug, it's not a one thing. It's, as we've already said, thousands of the varieties, or chemovars as we call them. The sativa indica is gone because there's so much interbreeding, nothing is pure this or that. And you don't want to get stuck on a plant that Blue Dream or whatever it is, that really worked for me. Well, if you got it in California, it might be an entirely different thing out in Virginia. So the easiest thing now is to break them up into the different types, chemotype 1, 2, and 3, 1 being predominantly THC, 2 being the balance of THC and CBD, and then 3 predominantly CBD. And a lot of times I think people are introducing the elderly or those who are afraid of getting high to start out maybe with a predominantly CBD just to see if that helps. And then of course, we're getting pharmaceutical products made from a lot of the cannabinoids in cannabis. This is another chart, and there were actually 2 physicians that were looking at this, Hennenfield from NIDA and Dr. Benowitz from University of California, San Francisco. But here they are rating these drugs. Now they say dependence in that one column, and they really mean more addiction, using a substance despite the problems that it's causing, disrupting a person's life, whereas withdrawal is talking about your physical dependence on a medication. So cannabis, they think that that's the least addictive. They both agreed on. As far as withdrawal, minimum withdrawal symptoms, less than caffeine for the most part. Tolerance develops slowly when we're talking about the whole plant. Reinforcement, more reinforcing than caffeine and more intoxicating than caffeine or nicotine. So when you look at that, if you're thinking of someone's just wanting to relax, that looks like a pretty safe bet compared to some of the other ones. And how many of you have run into people who say, oh my goodness, my kid got caught, drinking. Thank goodness it wasn't marijuana. And you're like, what are you thinking? They could be dead. So with substance abuse, I thought I'd best talk a little bit about the diagnosis, making the diagnosis, and where we are with cannabis use disorder as one of the substance use disorders. Trying to get rid of the terms abuse or dependence and using this. And there's 11 criteria to diagnose a substance use disorder. If a person only scores positive on 2 to 3, it's a mild. 4 to 6 symptoms, moderate substance use disorder, or 7 or more would be a severe problem. So I'm going to go through the 11 criteria. It's pretty much the same for all substances of abuse, but I want you to look at this. And, for everybody out there, you've got to look at this. Is it cannabis, or is it the cannabis prohibition that's causing some of these problems? So first criteria, it's taken in larger amounts or often for a longer period than was initially intended. 2, there's a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control cannabis use. I'm only going to use it on the weekends, only after work, whatever. A great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain cannabis, use cannabis, or recover from its effects. Just think if you live in one of those states where it's really illegal and you're not a grower, it might be tough to find your supply. It's craving, a strong desire or urge to use cannabis. Number 5, recurrent cannabis use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. Continued cannabis use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exacerbated by the effects of cannabis. 7, important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced because of cannabis use. And again, you could think of different examples, but I think of, mom's growing it for the son, or the child who's got seizure disorder or something. People can't come to the house. What if they smell it? What if they turn her in? And the sad truth is, I hate to get onto the real patient stories because they bring up the emotion, but the sad thing is, parents have lost their children because of this. We've had divorces, one just pointing, they use marijuana enough to make sure that that parent can't get the children. It's very, let alone prison sentences. If we go on, number 8 is recurrent cannabis use in situations in which it's physically hazardous. 9, cannabis use is continued despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that is likely to have been caused or exacerbated by cannabis. And then 10, 11, tolerance and withdrawal. I put the asterisks there because they do qualify it that those don't count if it's recommended by a physician, which always sounded a little funny. But the point being, if you were prescribed and taking your opiates as prescribed, you would become physically dependent, but that wouldn't mean you had an addiction problem. The problem we have here is, docs say, oh, they're using it. Have you developed tolerance or withdrawal? Again, usually the withdrawal symptoms are minimal, but it happens. I've seen it all over. Somebody comes in, they've got a positive drug test for THC, and the next thing I know, cannabis use disorder is added to their list of diagnoses. They've never assessed the person, they never asked why they're using it. They just decided, well, if it's in their system now, they must be abusing it. Withdrawal symptoms can happen, and this is the list they've got: irritability, anger, aggression, nervousness or anxiety, sleep difficulty, decreased appetite or weight loss, restlessness, depressed mood, and at least one of the following symptoms: abdominal pain, shakiness, tremors, sweating, fever, chills, or headache. Again, I'm not denying it can happen. If you're taking regular full flower cannabis, we metabolize it very slowly, which is the problem for the drug users. It's out of your system days later, weeks later, so you test positive. But it gradually gets out of the system. We generally don't have bad withdrawal symptoms. And then think about it. What if the person was using cannabis because they didn't have an appetite? They were having difficulty sleeping, and then you took their medicine away. Maybe they're going to have trouble sleeping, or they're going to get back to have that nausea, vomiting problem. Or they were using it for anxiety. So we want to be careful about making this assessment with cannabis. So the fact that it's not safe for medical use, highly addictive, and no accepted medical use in the United States. Well, one of the latest that I think most physicians out there, most clinicians should think of is the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. In 2017, their new book, they looked at all the evidence since 1999 when the Institute of Medicine did its report on cannabis. So they looked at all that new evidence, and they talked about its medical uses on different problems such as cancer, pain, anxiety, spasticity, et cetera. And they kind of qualified, is there conclusive evidence, substantial evidence, and it goes down to no evidence or mixed results. And they clearly said that substantial or conclusive evidence for chronic pain, for nausea and vomiting, for spasticity associated with MS. So deny this as medicine. I don't understand the healthcare professionals out there who are still stuck in this idea that there is no medical value. If you can't believe NAS, I don't know. The other thing that I like to note about that is when it came to possible adverse reactions, and they're saying, well, is it causing anxiety or is it causing depression? Anxiety is probably a great example. They look at all these different studies, but it's studies of patients using cannabis. What cannabis? Was it type 3, high in CBD, which would probably help someone's anxiety, used for treatment of anxiety, or was it something super stoner pot, as I will call it, but really high in THC, type 1, and getting them paranoid and very anxious? Well, we mix those all studies as though it's one drug. And again, it's a plant that is very, very diverse. So you still have to read this thing with that open eye of looking the fact that they're used to looking at drugs, and we're trying to reintroduce this as a plant medicine. I just want to, again, focusing on the plant, this is just a picture, actually it's a picture of Jeffrey Guy, GW Pharmaceuticals, but they've got their indoor grow. So this is a pharmaceutical, literally pharmaceutical grade cannabis being grown. And for those who don't know, that picture they're holding, that's what we really like that nice cola on a plant, all the flowers up top. Don't need to go through this again since people have heard it. It's a plant with many plant cannabinoids, phytocannabinoids, up to 144 have been identified. It's got terpenes that are over 200, flavonoids, at least 20 of those, amino acids, fatty acids. This plant has many chemicals, just like tomatoes, just like the vegetables we eat in our gardens and the flowers. So we shouldn't get so excited because they've got so many chemicals. Again, a repeat here, not a generic drug, thousands of varieties. We already went this, I know how that slide got in there again. But, so we look at the endocannabinoid system. Simply, I say it's a molecular signaling system within and throughout the human body, literally throughout. We had the slide earlier from Laura Logano. Vincenzo DeMargo had said that it helps us eat, sleep, relax, protect, and forget. Trying to just talk about how is this endocannabinoid system helpful for us. And that really does cover almost everything. When we think of it, it's more complex than I know. Patients out of time, I do the conferences and I get these brilliant minds coming and talking about it. It is such a complex system. So when we just kind of get it down to the basics, it's got the CB1, CB2 receptors, but we're finding there are other receptors in the body that react to cannabinoids. Endogenous cannabinoids, anandamide and 2-HG, and there are other cannabinoids. And then it's got the synthesizing and degrading enzymes that are involved in this process. Its primary purpose is maintaining balance or homeostasis, protecting us from stress, from a bad diet we're having, from pollution, from trauma, from injury. This system is helping us, the body heal itself. It will if we take care of it. And as noted before, this science, even though 1988, they first discovered the CB1 receptors, by 92, they found anandamide. By the mid-90s, they pretty much knew there's this whole system. By the mid-90s, it's 2021, and most universities still don't have it in their medical schools, nursing schools, pharmacology schools. Cripe, we should even be having this in high school when people learn about the human body. So what I want us to think about is switching to this new paradigm. Cannabis is a harm reduction agent, an exit drug, so be it. But possibly, clinicians hopefully will start looking this as a first-line treatment option for pain, for anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and more. Why give something much more powerful with many more potential side effects to someone to start with? You want to start with the least harmful medication. It can also be, think of cannabis using for treatment once a person does get dependent on a drug, this can help ameliorate many of the withdrawal symptoms, especially opioids, alcohol, benzodiazepines. These can be very dangerous for people coming off of. And as a substitution drug, we think of that with opiates. We give them either methadone or buprenorphine. So how about using cannabis for those suffering from alcohol abuse, nicotine, opioids, methamphetamine, cocaine? We're going to talk a little bit more on that. Those are some of the studies that have already looked at that. Here, I'm sorry, that name got cut off. That should be Ryman, Amanda Ryman. She's a social worker with a PhD. It'll be in the reference list. Anyway, she did a study looking at 350 patients from a Berkeley dispensary and looking at the patients in part of that survey saying that they use cannabis to substitute for other drugs. 66% use cannabis instead of their prescription drugs. 40% got off alcohol with cannabis. 26% got off other illicit drugs. Why? They said 65% have fewer adverse effects. 57% better symptom management. It works better. And 34% less withdrawal symptoms. And those should be something that gets us all excited. Philippe Lucas from Canada, meeting Amanda and talking, says, well, I'll do something up in Canada. So he surveyed 473 Canadian patients. Similar story. Overall, the substitution for prescription drugs, alcohol, and illicit drugs or illicit drugs was 87%. And more specifically, 80% got off of prescription drugs with it, 51% got off of alcohol, 32.6% from illicit drugs. This is huge. You know, I mean, we say it and you just kind of go, but this is huge. And you know who doesn't like it, unfortunately? It's the big pharma. Another study, Michelle Sexton and others, 2017, did a worldwide internet survey, and they got 2,774 self-selected, whoever signed on to do the survey, from 2013 to 2016. 46% reported using cannabis as a substitute for prescription drugs, with an average of 2 drug substitutions per responder. 36% found it a substitute from narcotics and opioids. 14% from anxiolytics and benzodiazepines, 13% from antidepressants, 10% from NSAIDs. Again, this is huge. For clinicians to not pay attention to this, it's mind-boggling. Again, this is Philippe Lucas and Walsh did another survey, 271 Canadian cannabis patients. 25% of these used cannabis as a substitute for alcohol. 12% used it as a substitute for cigarettes and tobacco being a very difficult dependence to break. 3% used cannabis as a substitute for illicit drugs. 63% used cannabis as a substitute for prescription drugs, specifically 30% from opioids, 16% from benzodiazepines, and 12% from antidepressants. So clearly, this can help, as we say, an exit from drugs. Then we look at drug overdose deaths. And again, I apologize. I'm going to say Bachhuber, get his name right. Should have been on there. Anyway, oh, this is a different one. Looking at the report. Apologize, I'm thinking of a different slide. Anyway, this is new just because think of COVID now and what changes we've had. There's just been almost a 30% increase in the deaths since 2020, since we got the lockdown. Over 72,000 deaths in 2019, up to 93,000 plus in 2020. Specifically for opioids, over 50,000 deaths in 2019, up to 69,710 in 2020. Stimulants have increased 47%, and cocaine increased by 22%. We do have a drug problem in the United States. And again, over and over, so many of us saying, look at cannabis, look at cannabis. Why can't these universities get it into the med schools? Clinicians want to know. And they've done surveys. Med students, nursing students want to know. This other study, the cannabis for use disorder, this is kind of a review of the studies out there that Weiss and Wilson Poe did in 2018, and their conclusions looking at all the studies there, that prevention of opioid use disorder for chronic pain patients treated with opioids, opiate-sparing effects. Again, why not start with cannabis, or at least add it to your patients with chronic pain, especially chronic neuropathic pain? Opiates aren't that great. I mean, to be successful, they have to really dull the patient down. I mean, really medicate them heavily. And most patients say, I'm working in a fog. I'm not clear-headed. It can alleviate opioid withdrawal symptoms, as I said earlier with the other studies, and may help prevent relapse by decreasing the craving for opioids. So let's look at some of that. I used to work at an opioid treatment program in Charlottesville, Virginia. We used methadone and Suboxone, buprenorphine. And with that, for those who don't know, the induction period for treatment with methadone is a very scary period because this is all outpatient. Patient comes in, you assess them with the opioid withdrawal scale, you give them methadone, but you've got to start at a low dose, 30 milligrams, because we don't know what they've really been taking, and 30 milligrams to me would knock me out. So we start slow. They have to come back the next day, reassess their opiate withdrawal symptoms, up the dose a little bit. They come back the next day. It might take a week, it might take a month, it might take longer to get them at their maintenance dose. Well, during that time, opiate addicts don't like the feeling of withdrawal. Obviously, it's not very comfortable. So the sad part is, but the reality is that they often go out and self-medicate. And so they might go off and find some benzodiazepines on the street. They might go out and find a short-acting opiate on the street. And the problem is they take that medication, and meanwhile, the methadone is going up and getting to the peak, and those two together can be lethal. We lose patients during the induction period. They're not under 24-hour care watching them. So anyway, at the Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, Scavone and others did a study in 2013, and they were looking at, not that they were doing this, but knowing that their outpatients were using cannabis as well. Those who used cannabis, it was associated with decreased symptoms of opiate withdrawal. They stayed in. They could manage to stay through until they got their maintenance dose. So their conclusion was that this is a potential role for cannabis during methadone induction. I was very lucky when I worked at the treatment program in Virginia that when I called to ask about the job as executive director, I said, well, you need to know that I run a nonprofit, Patients Out of Time, which educates about cannabis. And the owner of the program said, that's terrific, come on in. We were the only treatment program in Virginia that didn't test for THC. Some of our counselors that were there were kind of wondering what was wrong with us at first, because federally we didn't have to. You can test for more things than you need to, but federally we didn't have to, and I think most treatment programs do test for cannabis, so we didn't care. Better than be safe than using it, and what are we gonna do if it's positive? So we let that go. This one by Yasmin Hurd from Mount Sinai was looking at its use for opioid use disorder, looking at heroin users. I think they had a sample of 42 heroin users, anywhere from less than a month that they've stopped using heroin, they've gone through withdrawal, they've stopped using it, up to 3 months. So these are fresh, new people, and environmental cues are big things. They might see the syringe, they might see something on TV or something. It'll get them going, feeling like they're using it again, and it's very easy for them to fall back into use again. So she did this double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study using CBD for drug cue-induced craving, so they're seeing something or being with friends who used, whatever it may be, and anxiety in drug-abstinent individual with heroin use disorder. Again, I said they were fresh people. So, and they looked at, they were rating this at these different periods, acute, short-term, long-term. So acute, once they gave the CBD, they're looking at rating them 1, 2, and 24 hours after that. After 3 consecutive uses of CBD, they're looking at that. And then that last dose, till 7 days later, they looked again. And they clearly saw that there was a significant reduction in the cues for them getting activated. The heart rate was lower, salivary cortisol levels were lower. So it was basically showing that this can be a good treatment when someone early in recovery to help them from relapsing. And they're so vulnerable during that period of time. Okay, another one. Naltrexone is, as an opiate receptor antagonist, often used for patients with heroin addiction problems or alcoholism. So in this one, again, study at New York State Psychiatric Institute, 63 patients looking at, they found that there was higher retention in the program using naltrexone for those patients who used cannabis on the side. Again, it wasn't part of their protocol, but when looking back, because of the drug screens they do on these patients, they found that. So when we're looking at cannabis, we see that it's, I call it a special medicine. From nursing, it would answer so many of our problems. There's a nursing shortage now. I mean, I know a lot of it's COVID because that's been so stressful for so many nurses. But even before that, we spend our time chasing after drugs with patients. We give them some medication, and now we have to come back because they're nauseated from it. We give them another medication. Oh, now we found them that they fell in the bathroom because of the side effect of the medication. They can't sleep at night. We've got to give them something. And my dream has been at any hospital, and I bring up UVA because I know it, it's got 2 medical units. that basically, it's got all the different medical, but 2 general medicine units. It's just luck of the draw which one you go for. What a perfect place for an experiment, Train the clinicians on using cannabis in this one and offer it to patients, and let the other ones be status quo. And yeah, we need to do a study like that, but I'll bet you'll have not only healthier, happier patients doing better, but the nursing staff will actually feel like they're doing nursing care. Giving them something that's, knowing it's very safe. That's a big thing for nurses, in that we do give the medications. The idea that you just gave the wrong medication to a patient, because we are giving, you can't believe the amount of pills we give sometimes, and the amount of patients, and trying to get it all on time and all to the right patient, the right dose, et cetera. To walk away from a room or something like that and go, oh my God, that was the wrong patient. I've done it. I think other nurses have, but heart starts pounding and you're wondering, what did I just do? Could be very scary. With cannabis, it's like, oops. I mean, and seriously, I'd be kind of going, oops, because I wouldn't worry that I'm going to cause some serious long-term problem to the patient. But this wide margin of safety, it's unbelievable, the fact that you can take so much of cannabis. When, again, speaking to that safety factor, as was said, I'm just realizing I lost another slide in here. I apologize, guys. But compared to others, and it's been said before, no overdoses from cannabis. You can't say that about other drugs. Dr. Arthur McBay, now deceased, but he was a chief toxicologist in North Carolina for years. So back in the 80s, when he talked about this, he said, I think the only way to die from cannabis, for marijuana, he called it marijuana, would be if a bale of it, this is when everybody was smuggling it, if a bale of it fell from a plane and hit you on the head. And another way somebody said it was, you'd have to consume 1,500 pounds in 15 minutes. How can you do that? So just think of that. Aspirin's over the counter, and we have deaths every year from aspirin. Tylenol over the counter. Alcohol, no big deal. How many deaths in college kids do we have from that? So this wide margin of safety should give every clinician this feeling of why not try it. The rapid onset of action for inhaling cannabis, and even sublingual. It allows that patient to self-titrate so easily, to figure out what dose works for them. Again, the clinicians need to understand whichever route a patient's taking this medicine, to help them understand when is that onset of action. And it's been said before, it needs to be said again. The oral medications take a while. We've all seen it. It's just really sad to see. And the labeling, the fact that people make a candy bar that has 100 milligrams in it, and it might just be 10 milligrams per square. I eat a whole candy bar. I don't have a little piece. I love chocolate. And oftentimes I'm seeing it, and the label's small. I mean, it needs to be glaring. Either make them in, your little bite-sized pieces of a small dose, or in big writing, have for the whole bar, because patients do this all the time. And I'll share the funny story with a police officer, and some of you might have heard it because it got wild on YouTube. Some cop took some of the confiscated pot home to make brownies. He and his girlfriend are having a good time. They made the brownies, but the next thing you know, he's calling 911. And it's, help, help. I think I'm dying. Had some marijuana brownies. I think I'm dying. No, wait, I think I'm dead. Regardless, he obviously got ridiculed. But they had a brownie and it tasted really good. Nothing happened. Let's have another one. I don't know how many he ended up having, but that's a biggie with edibles. And the elderly going to some place and trying cannabis without the guidance from a healthcare professional or somebody who knows how, they may never try cannabis again. They've gone, they've done it wrong, they way overdosed, they're so dizzy, they can't stand up, they might be very nauseated, terrible. So again, the idea that you can self-titrate is again another great thing for patients. I think some clinicians have trouble letting go of not being able to say exactly what that dose is. They've just got to relax and say, this is plant medicine, it is different. But the idea that you can improve sleep. We talk about side effects for medications. Somebody else, I don't know who coined it, but I heard it from somebody else talking about their side benefits with cannabis. So with your standard pharmaceuticals, often side effects, and this one you get side benefits. I took it for pain, but my golly, I slept great last night. Or I took it for my nausea and vomiting, and my chronic back pain was so much better. So you get all of these things with this medicine, quelling the nausea and vomiting, improving the appetite, anti-inflammatory. And it's such a powerful anti-inflammatory. And as we get older, so many of our diseases are from inflammation in one form or another. The decreasing the pain, it is synergistic with opioids. And that's a whole lecture in itself. There's so many studies out there, but adding cannabis to opioids, literally it will slow the development of tolerance. It's synergistic, so they need a lower dose. Patients on their own lower their dose because they know they don't need it anymore. Surprise, I mean, they come back and they just go, wow, I didn't need it. Can, as we already learned, decrease or eliminate other conventional medications. And clearly, this fits in our looking at this as a harm reduction medication. So I want to go open it up to a few other things, but I go back after all of this, if people can look at this and say, this is a medicine first that happens to have some psychoactive properties, as many medicines do, rather than as an intoxicant that happens to have a few therapeutic properties on the side. I think the other thing we want to talk with patients about when they come in is, I don't want to get high. They're so afraid. That's what they, reefer madness and all that. And you have to ask them, what do you mean by that? What do you fear? Oh, I'm not, I'm going to do things that I wouldn't do before. I won't know what's going on. Greg Gerdeman, a PhD, had told me before about, I think we've all heard of runner's high. And they say, oh, those are the endorphins kicking in. Our morphine-like chemicals that we make the endorphins, we make the endocannabinoids. And it turns out, no, it really is the endocannabinoids kicking in. But a runner's high means I feel great. Everything's working just well. I feel bliss, happy. That's the high, the euphoric feeling. And so for patients fearing this, that's why sometimes we just ease them into it. Maybe the high CBD, then try some type 2 chemovars with a close ratio of CBD to THC, because that CBD will actually dampen down the high from THC. So if you have just a type 1 high THC, that could be very unnerving for some patients not used to it. You give them the THC, so you still want the benefits of THC, but with the CBD, if it's 10% THC alone, okay, but if it's 10% THC, but it's got a good percentage of CBD, they're not going to get overly stimulated with it. I also want to bring, and I'm not pushing books. In fact, folks, you out there, too bad, you don't get to be around. Michael Green will have some books on, cannabis books on display. He's got a great selection of books. But I bring these up, whoops. Yeah. These two up because they specifically are addressing the opioid, its use with other substances. So I think it's a good one. Uwe Bleshing, The Breaking the Cycle of Opioid Addiction, Supplement Your Pain Management with Cannabis. And Dustin Sulek's new book has a specific area on looking at that, as do others. There are so many books out there, and there's no excuse for people to say you can't find this information. And the listening to patients. Above all, we need to literally start listening to our patients, and we learn from them. Patients Out of Time started because of that. Didn't say, again, it was alluded to, and for those who don't understand how crazy this whole system is, Dr. Bierman talked about the Investigational New Drug Program. They call it the Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program, or IND program. And back by Robert Randall was the first person into it. He won a legal case to show that he would go blind without cannabis. He won that case, and so his lawyers managed to work with NIDA to say, okay, you busted him for growing pot, but he needs it, he proved it. Now, he needs a supply. So he got it from the farm in the University of Mississippi where they grow cannabis. At this point in time, the only place, although now they're gonna open up to allow more places to go government-controlled cannabis, because you can't do research on cannabis unless you do with their cannabis, which is really low quality. But Bob got access to it, and he recognized this is not fair. I get cannabis to treat this, but it's illegal for everybody else out there. Very brave man. So he and his wife, Alice O'Leary, founded the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics. That's the other thing. I mean, I no more than did my survey, and then I was learning about the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics, and they were working with Normal, so it was this kind of deja vu for me. But slowly they added other patients, and by 1990, there were 5 patients. At 1990, there were 5 patients, and we actually made a video of them, Marijuana as Medicines, featuring those 5 patients. And I showed it at several State Nurses Association meetings and literally got them to pass resolutions to support medical cannabis, because this were real patients just talking about how it helped them. And then by that was picked up. We did it at Normal. We had them talk about this at a conference, and C-SPAN picked it up. So across the United States, people were seeing these 5 patients talking about their cannabis use. Normal had over 40,000 phone calls within the next week. I mean, they were just inundated. How do I get this? How do I get this? People started learning about the program, and the FDA got inundated with all these requests to get into the program. This was AIDS epidemic time, so most of them were HIV positive AIDS patients trying to get cannabis to help them. And by this time, they had 15 patients in the program, and that's when they closed it down. So they closed down early, and by 1992, nobody. And they had 15 patients in the program. They had 30-some, the numbers are vague because they keep the stuff secret from us all, but there were 30-some patients who were approved of cannabis but hadn't gotten their supply, and the government said, and you're not going to. And then there were hundreds of applications that they weren't even going to look at. We're not even going to look at them. Programs closed. That was 1992. That's what stimulated patients out of time. By 1995, there were only 8 of those 15 patients still living. It was very clear that the government did not want us to know. It has no medical value. It's in Schedule 1, but we're giving patients this marijuana. And it's so atrocious. They'd get it in a canister. So it's grown in Mississippi, then brought up to North Carolina, where all the tobacco industry there, in that research triangle. And that's where it would be processed and rolled. So when you open the canister, it's like a honeycomb of just, all these marijuana cigarettes, 300 in a canister. Low THC, freeze-dried. Some of their canisters over the years were 10 to, I don't know, I think the highest number might have been 14 years old. Now, who gives medications that are that old? We have our medications, we buy this stuff in the store, and I look at the expiration label to see if it's late enough, I'll use it. They get this stuff, and it was so dry. Elvie Masika, one of the patients, would take her cannabis out. She used it for glaucoma. She'd take it out of the cigarettes, put it in a baggie with a lettuce leaf or something to try to get a little humidity back into the stuff. I mean, this was brittle dry. And she actually quit smoking with use of cannabis, so she chose to use it through cookies. She'd make cookies and eat it. And of course, for glaucoma, not a bad idea for her, because you want something that's going to be longer acting to keep those eye pressures at the right level. So again, it's a repeating theme when it comes to cannabis. The plant itself is very diverse. We humans are very diverse. And it's such a beautiful medicine that you can literally try to find what is right for you, for your condition at this particular time, which might be different. Think of a woman when she's now pregnant. Maybe I'm going to want something for nausea and vomiting. That's a whole nother issue. That's an issue that we have a hard time with. It's been used for centuries by women who are pregnant, using it for morning sickness. In Jamaica, it actually helps them feel like they can still better take care of their children, and that it gives them energy to work. But we're never going to do a double-blind placebo study on cannabis use during pregnancy. So it just means that clinicians, rather than shaming your patients who are going to tell you that they're going to use cannabis, follow them. You might not be recommending it, but you can follow them and basically find out what is the problem. Because when Melanie Dreyer did her study in Jamaica on pregnant women smoking ganja, She didn't find those negative results because in the United States, when we're doing them, the mothers were often maybe smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, taking other medications, not getting any prenatal care. It could be so many other factors, but the studies would say, oh, marijuana causes, smaller babies and the babies with these kinds of problems. Whereas in Jamaica, they're getting healthy babies. And historically, one of the things that they did, just traditional medicine, was give, very often the babies, one of the first things they would get was a cannabis tea, because they just thought it helped the baby do better. And when you think about it, that works too. I'm going to go one sidestep on this, just because it's so interesting. In 2002, when we had our cannabis conference in Portland, Oregon, Esther Fried from Raphael Meshulam's lab came, and her study was looking at, as we know, we've got an endocannabinoid system. Well, breast milk has endocannabinoids in it. And so she studied rats or mice, I don't know. But anyway, looking at rat having a normal litter of pups and then the other one, and blocked the endocannabinoid in the mother as soon as she delivered, all those babies died. Did another experiment, and this time they waited a day and they blocked it. And those little pups were, half of them died, and the other half were like half the weight compared to the control group. They did it again. If they blocked the endocannabinoid on the third day, there was no difference. But the baby's got this. We're thinking, and she's thinking, helping with the suckling. I mean, they know to go to the nipple to suckle, but the others weren't suckling. So this is something, innately, it's so important to us. But anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for your time. And I'll be, if anybody wants to email me, write me, call, whatever, I'm available for questions. Education, what you know now, teach others, spread the word. Thank you.
Wow, beautiful. This is just such wonderful pearls of wisdom that we have been shown here today. Now we get to have a 10-minute break. We're going to come back and we're going to be next up at 3:25 is Dr. David Ostro. See you in 10.